what we're about to talk about tonight is not for people who believe the Bible's God's word because they just do, because of the Holy Spirit, because they had an experience when they were young, because their parents taught them. This talk is not for you. If you hear this, you click on this and you say, well, the Bible's God's word because it says so, go somewhere else, because this talk's not for you. But Cam here came up with a great, what would you call it? Article, great method, great thing that
Well, I don't want to pretend like I'm that this is original to me. I think it's really an accumulation of a lot of authors and a lot of different perspectives.
right, but you compiled it together into a nice, neat and tidy description. So why don't I give it to you now? What kind of background do we need to, if we are truth seekers looking to see what about the Bible is true, if anything, what should we know?
Good question. So the Gospels were obviously written at a point in time, and that particular point in time was the Greco-Roman period. And at that time, Greek and Latin were very popular languages. And the authors of the Gospels were writing in Greek. And one thing to know about Greek education in the Roman Empire is that students were often trained in certain techniques of composition, much in the same way as if you're like an English student today in class, you might get taught some kind of creative writing exercise, or you might get taught a particular style of writing to convey, some element that you were trying to convey. And so in the particular period in question, there were some really popular works and there were some really popular ways of writing. And one of those methods of composition was called imitation or mimesis. And a great example of this in the ancient world is Virgil's Aeneid. And in this book, it's deliberately modeled, the author deliberately models its stories from the Homeric epics and recasts them and retells them with different characters, emphasizing different values and telling a different story that the author thought was more important than Homer's original composition.
Okay, so what you're saying is whoever wrote the Gospels, is it like 99% chance they read Homer and other works of the day?
Yeah, so in the period in question, Homer was a very popular author, both to be read and also to have his stories acted out in plays, even in public. And it's at least going off some authors like Tim Whitmarsh and other authors who have studied the period in question with a focus on the Homeric epics. He was so widely read that effectively anybody who went through a Greek education and learned to read and write Greek within a school would have come in contact with the Homeric epics.
Okay. And so we have a situation where in that time period, everybody was aware of, okay, who are some authors that they would have read besides Homer?
I think, well, if you were Latin, speaking Latin, then Virgil's Aeneid would be pretty well known, or became very well known. Also, Herodotus was well known as well. Lucian. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of popular authors of the time, but supreme among them apparently was Homer. And my claims here aren't to say anything about the Gospels like that we should expect them to have imitated Homer. And in fact, much of what I'll say later on doesn't really depend on this. But the point that I'm making in general is that at the time, it wasn't as if authors were these hick-like people, or necessarily were hick-like people. A lot of them actually were educated. And within their education often involved the usage of certain literary techniques, much in the way a modern author would learn literary techniques. And and we'll get to a little bit later about why that's relevant. But a lot of the presumption that people come to with the Gospels is based on the Gospel narratives themselves. They assume that the Gospels were written by characters depicted within the Gospels themselves. For example, Matthew and Luke and Mark and John. Now, these assumptions don't seem to be valid when you actually study the authorship of the Gospels themselves. And why that's relevant is that people often assume that because Jesus's followers were from like a lower class of society, they were expected to be fairly uneducated and perhaps even illiterate. And so when people imagine the Gospels having been written by them, they struggle to imagine them as authors who were creative composers attempting to tell a story. They instead think of them as if they are writing memoirs or some kind of idea like this. But at least my perspective on the Gospels is that that's just not the case. These people were quite educated in the Greek language, and they were educated enough to both compose stories and write a narrative.
And we don't know where these Gospels were written, do we?
There's no certainty around that for any of the Gospels. Mark, I think, like the most popular hypothesis is that Mark was written in Rome, or at least outside of Judea. And as to the other Gospels, I don't really know, to be honest. And I don't really think that anybody knows exactly where they were written, because we pretty much know nothing about their authors. Christians will often claim that we do because they accept the testimony of later Christian authors who first give us evidence of the naming of the Gospels. But those authors, I don't think were the ones who wrote them. I think that they were originally anonymously circulated and not attributed to like particular characters that appear in the text.
And the Gospels were written, so we don't know where they were written, but they could have been written in Rome. And it was written all post 70 AD, according to scholars, correct?
Yes, that's where the mainstream consensus is that all Gospels, including Mark, were after 70 AD.
Now, why do some Christians say that it was written before 70
Cynically, I honestly think that they want them to be written closer to Jesus's lifetime. And I think they also don't want to consider the claims and predictions of the destruction of the Jewish temple as being, retrodictions put on the lips of Jesus. I think that that's a very, how should I put it? It's kind of a blasphemous idea. And I think that a lot of like evangelical Christians and fundamentalist Christians, they just really struggle to accept that hypothesis.
So let's you call them markers. So let's look at some markers of, if you're truth seeker, I'll call it, who cares whether, if you don't just assume everything in the Gospels is true, what are some markers that we should look for to help us decide whether the Gospels or any ancient text is talking historically or not?
I think there are a number of markers that can demonstrate that a particular text that you're looking at has a better chance of conveying historically accurate information in its stories. And I'll go through a couple of examples of that. One such marker would be that the author tells you who they are, and they give you some piece of information about their identity that allows you to understand how it is that they know the things that they're talking about. So they might place themselves in a relevant time and place that makes plausible the claims that they're saying. So maybe they make a claim to have interviewed somebody who witnessed the events they describe, or they make a claim to have a particular source that they're assessing for its reliability itself. And another example would be that they tell you something a little bit about their methods. So when they report a claim, they might tell you about how they went about reporting it. So whether or not they just copied down exactly what the people said and claimed, or whether or not, this is in the assumption that they're interviewing eyewitnesses, or they claim to have deliberated on the information that they received from a source and evaluated it and gave their best judgment. And another indication of reliability would be where an author, I think it goes back to methods again, but gives you some kind of criteria that they are using to separate the sources of information that they're dealing with. So, for example, there might be more than one tradition that the author receives, and when they tell you about some kind of choice that they made among those sources that they use to effectively report it to you. And in fact, they might even do something like report both traditions to you or report both sources to you, giving you the ability to evaluate the information that they were receiving.
So to me, that's all just very common sense stuff. If you're writing history, you should say who you are, how you got your information, how you sorted the information, how you relied on the information, who you got it from. But is this type of criteria, these markers for historicity, were they common back then? Or was this like modern Western world type stuff we're heaping upon the ancient world and our expectations are way too high? Like, did historians of that time actually do these things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are definitely historians that didn't, and some element of what I'm claiming here is based upon like a modern standard of historiography and like a modern epistemology. And yeah, it isn't the case that all authors of the period or all historians of the period in question did this. But some of them did. And one example, a historical example of this phenomena is in Thucydides, where Thucydides makes us aware of some elements of how he composed or reported speeches found within his history of the Peloponnesian War. In particular, he says this: "In this history, I have made use of set speeches, some of which were delivered just before and others during the war. I have found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. So my method has been, while keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speakers say what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation." Now, this is that's the end of the quote, but this is a wealth of information with respect to Thucydides' method. So it gives us strong reason to doubt the historical reliability of his speeches in general found within the text, because he makes it clear here that he makes the speakers say what, in his opinion, was called for in the situation, and he makes clear that he was unable to remember, and his informants were unable to remember the precise words in these speeches. This is an example of something that we don't have with respect to the Gospels. In the Gospels, all speeches and all words of Jesus are taken to, or at least reported, without any doubt or disclaimer of inaccuracy potentially introduced by the nature of the failing of human memory.
So ironically, if the author of Mark actually came out and admitted, I could be wrong about what I'm about to say, but that would lend a lot of credibility to it. But we see no examples of that. It's just taken as God's truth.
Yeah, and that's the funny, effective ironic thing is that if he actually made some comments about where where we could rely more or where we could rely less on what he's saying, it would give us some greater ability to understand how he came to know what he knows. Like in this section of the text, whether or not we trust the author, Thucydides does claim that he was present at some of the speeches and had informants able to. Now, this, I actually think that some modern historians actually doubt that this was the case. But even then, this is information that we just don't have with respect to any of the Gospels, and information that places them in a category unlike just even a bad historian of the ancient era.
So when was this written, what you read to us? Because you're giving us an example of first-person historical narrative, correct? And the Gospels, for the most part, are third-person narrative.
Yes. So it was written... at least the Peloponnesian War was 431 to 404 BC, okay. And the book, was obviously written sometime after that. But I don't know whether or not we know exactly when it was written.
So if a Christian says to me, "But Doug, that's just how things were written back then. They didn't use first person back then," I can say, "No," and here's an example.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of examples of first-person reporting. There are even examples of later Christian Gospels using the type of first-person narrative that we would expect from an eyewitness source, because at least that Gospel's author knew what it would sound like if you were reporting on events. And this is, in this particular case, we don't actually trust that Gospel was written by an eyewitness because of how late it is. But at least I think it's like the... maybe Acts of John or something like that. It's a non-canonical gospel, a non-canonical Christian text.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about the dating again, that I always use the 1%. It's about 10% of the people at best could read and write back then, and about 10% would live past the age 45, 50 back then at best. And assuming those are two independent events, 10% times 10% is 1%. So the probability of the Gospels, if they were written after 70 AD, that anybody who saw Jesus, knew Jesus, wrote the Gospels is 1%.
Right. And I mean, it's further complicated by the fact that they were written in Greek. And if we are to believe what Christians want to claim about the authors, they more likely would have been speaking Aramaic and would have been unlikely to have spoken Greek. So it becomes even more improbable that the people who traditional Christianity identifies as the authors would have actually been the authors.
And anybody who might have lived that long, there's also a high probability that the Gospels were written in Italy, 500 miles or plus away, and they would have no idea what was written about this guy that they really, really knew. And so that they wouldn't even have a chance to say, "Oh, by the way, this never happened." Well, they're 500
Yes,
miles away.
yeah, exactly. This idea that there would have been some kind of easy way for people in the know to corroborate or dismiss or like contradict the accounts I just think is untrue. I mean, we even have examples of other myths where, we get no kind of contradiction of those and we know that they're myths. Like, almost every historian thinks that they're false, but yet we find no counter claims made against them. One thing that you learn quickly when dealing with historical sources is that it very much is just like a game of lack of information, and we often have an inability to make certain conclusions about what occurred in the past, and instead we are just trying to reconstruct hypotheses, tentative conclusions about what occurred, and use probabilistic methods to assess the sources that we have left.
Do any Christians actually claim that the Gospels do what you are asking right now, the markers that you're presenting? Do any Christians say, "Oh no, the Gospels do say who wrote them and where exactly they got their sources"? Do they make these claims? Have you heard anybody make those claims?
There's two places where I think people try to claim this. One is in the prologue, or like kind of like an introduction to the Gospel of Luke. He makes a claim of writing an orderly account based on sources, but he doesn't say anything about who those sources were. And as it turns out, we actually have one of Luke's sources, and it happens to be the Gospel of Mark. Yet the Gospel of Mark doesn't tell us anything about his sources and methods. In fact, doesn't even tell us anything about himself. And so we know at least that the author of Luke was relying on a text that, when we attempt to assess whether or not it meets these criteria, it doesn't.
And Luke?
And then the other case is John. John mentions an eyewitness or something like that in chapter 20 or 21, or the author of John. But yeah, what were you going to say?
Does Luke even claim to have talked to eyewitnesses?
I don't interpret the prologue that way, no.
Yeah, as far as I know,
I don't. He makes no claim to have interviewed eyewitnesses.
He just claims to have compiled information.
Yeah, I think that the right way to interpret it is him claiming to have relied on information that he claims traces back to the very beginning or something like that.
Okay, so let's recap. You're basically saying if you have a text in front of you from way back and you're wondering, hey, is this history or not? You should ask yourself, do we know who wrote this? Do we know where they got their information about the stuff they're talking about? Do they criticize the information at all? Like, are they critical of it? They weigh in at, maybe even talking about contradictory stuff that they're finding and choosing one over the other and telling you why.
Exactly.
Okay,
but
yeah,
this is really just the first step, because this is what we would expect from a source. It's kind of like, it's almost like a minimum bar, and it is possible that, like, even if these things weren't the case, we might still look at the source, and because of its how well it like fits with a surrounding context and the nature of the claims made. For example, like if they're just mundane claims about like military history or something like that, we might actually have some confidence in its reliability. But there are further things that kind of cut in the opposite direction. So the things I listed there were things that, if they were present, would give us like reason to place more credence in the source. But there are also things that could be present in the text that would cause us to place less credence in the source and the source's reliability. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, imitation was like widely popular and learned about in schools of the time in question. And so one thing that you could find in a text is imitation or emulation of existing stories that the author plausibly knew sometimes even using direct wording from them, and often like improving on these stories by contrasting values, embellishment, and yeah, other similar things that indicate imitation. There's a word that is often used called transvaluation, where it takes like the meaning of an author will take the meaning and values of an original story and then recast it in a different light, more in line with either the message that the author is trying to sell, or alternatively, like the values of the community that the author belongs to. So that's imitation.
But I can foresee some of the pushback on that. And if a Christian hears you say that, they're going to say, well, but they're not exactly the same, Cam. In fact, there's way, way more differences than similarities. So why is this valuable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would claim that I think that we can develop a method to identify or like fairly reliably identify cases of imitation, but it's also important to understand what imitation actually was in the ancient world. And I'll just read something that might give a bit of indication about that. So this is reading from Tim Whitmarsh's book, Greek Literature and the Roman Empire. So the dominant notion in the literary aesthetic was mimesis, which is imitation. Mimesis marks not only the traditional temper of Greek-Roman culture, but also its modernity. An imitation of a literary forebear is not simply a xerographic reproduction, but also a transformation. Roman Greek literature marks its innovative flavor in numerous ways, but most conspicuously by the near-universal adoption of prose ahead of poetry. So what he's saying there is, in cases of imitation, you shouldn't expect to find exact copies of an idea. There can be variations, and often the variation on the original, what they call an antitext, often that variation is the precise point of the emulation. So it's sometimes the reversal of some theme or some values in the prior text that is the point of the emulation. That was imitation, and the claim there is that authors can imitate prior stories or prior myths, or and stuff like that. So another one would be the use of literary devices. So as people know, in fiction, commonly literary devices are employed to almost like make it entertaining reading, and employed in ways that don't typically occur in everyday life. I mean, sometimes ironic things happen in everyday life, but in literature we find things like dramatic irony, the use of particular compositional structures like sandwiching, where you have a story enveloping another story that each play off one another, or foreshadowing, or a like subversion of the reader's expectations. So where something incredibly surprising happens because the author set you up to think one thing was going to happen, and then it reverses. So that would be the use of literary devices. Okay. And there are many examples of that in compositional writing, but there are also examples of it in the Gospels.
Okay, so we have imitation, we have literary techniques like foreshadowing, irony. What else?
So historical implausibility.
Now, this was the big one for me when I was coming out of Christianity.
Yeah, so this is not based on the presumption or the assumption that historically implausible things can't happen, but the understanding that by nature of them being implausible, they aren't very likely. So when a claim is made that something historically implausible did occur, we do kind of expect some evidence corresponding to that implausibility. So particularly good evidence is expected in such cases. So implausibility is where, say, like central elements of a story critically and repeatedly depend on things that are improbable. For example, apparent violations of how the world usually works, as informed by, say, science, for example, where we don't have any corroboration of those outside things occurring. And some examples of that would be like miracle claims, improbable human behavior. So, for example, when a character behaves in like a very strange way that you wouldn't really expect any kind of human to behave, but instead is more in line with, say, how a literary character would behave. And just in general, things that contradict or clash against our background knowledge of, say, like the period in question, or like physics.
Yeah, so if you open up a book and it says a man flew to the moon and back, like just with himself, that's it. Odds are it's not historical.
Odds are. So another one would be interpretability. So when you find something within a text and when you interpret it as a real event, but it doesn't really make sense. Like maybe if you're trying to, when you're attempting to understand it as something that really occurred, it makes you confused. Like it's very unexpected, perhaps because a character is behaving very strangely, or you don't understand why it is that a character does a certain thing. But instead, when you look at the text as some kind of meaningful fiction, when you look at it as like something symbolic or something that has like, an alternate way of interpreting it that doesn't depend on it being a real thing that actually occurred, when you do that, the text makes much more sense. So here I have... To read this out, where the text makes less sense as real events but more sense as fiction, or where events are best understood through the lens of a later developed religious tradition, for example, practices or ceremonies. Yeah.
Okay, so when you're reading a text, basically you're saying if it makes more sense if you think it's fiction, maybe it is.
Yeah, I think it's a bit more, I think it's a bit stronger than that. It's more that when you try to interpret something, and we'll get to an example later on, but when you try to interpret it as something that really happened, it really doesn't make sense of what is described. But when instead you interpret it through a more of a symbolic interpretation, you can understand like what the story is really trying to say.
Got it. Okay.
And often the strangeness of the story when interpreted as a real story is a case where it like clashes with what our usual expectations of what normal people do. And we'll get to an example of that. So next would be all-knowing narration. So often in fictional composition, you will find that an author knows something about a character because that author literally is the character. The author is composing what you are reading out of their imagination. And so they're able to describe details about what that character is thinking or feeling that wouldn't be apparent if it were actually a historical occurrence. Like as I just mentioned, this might be where you're talking about the character Bob, and you say that Bob was in a toilet stall all by himself, and he was crying, and he felt very pained because he had this decision to make.
Did this happen to you today?
No. But it would be an example where, well, who really would have known that this person was in a toilet stall crying, especially if we're given no indication that the author knows that because somebody, say, overheard it or anything like that. But more importantly, if the author is describing something about the state of mind of that person, for example, what they were thinking or what they were feeling, that's an indication of all-knowing narration. But it can occur in other ways as well, where just an event is being described, where there's no plausible way in which the author could have learned about what occurred, perhaps because the character being narrated subsequently dies, and there wouldn't have been any opportunity to convey that information. Or there were no witnesses present, or other things like that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking like when the times it says in the Gospels Jesus was by himself and said certain things or did certain things, if you're viewing this as historical, like how would the author know this if Jesus was by himself? Right?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. So another one is apparent credulity. So this is kind of like what I was talking about right at the beginning when I was talking about cases where we would find our confidence increased in a text if they, for example, weighed their sources critically. I guess the reverse side of that is where an author narrates things and those things are amazing, like they're incredible claims, but yet the author expresses no like indication that they find these things amazing. They give no indication of their like incredulity towards what it is that they're narrating, and no assessment of any kind of credibility. So an example of this would be like the Lord of the Rings, where you have some kind of magical ring. Or you have these like flying eagles that can rescue anybody, and you have a wizard who has magical powers and can do all sorts of things with his staff. And of course, the author of the Lord of the Rings just expresses no amazement at this whatsoever. There's no indication that that there should be any surprise or any trouble understanding the story as being true, because the author is writing it as if it's true. And yeah. Whereas like in everyday life, when we tell about stories, when we tell each other stories that we found incredible, that we were really surprised occurred, but nonetheless did, we really emphasize how surprised we were. We like give indication of how amazing it was or how incredible it was.
Yeah, if I was writing a history book about my life and something amazing happened, I would say, you're not going to believe this, but this is what I saw. And as far as I know, nowhere in the Bible does it say you're not going to believe this, but yeah, that's a good point. That it's basically the author just taking this, oh yeah, this mundane miracle happened. I'm just stating it as fact. No reason to doubt this. Let's move along. It might talk about the characters, though, that in the story might have doubted, but you're saying it's the author who's not doubting it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, because the author is never really. I mean, cause what you find in the Gospels is that the author is never really part of the story. It occurs a little bit in the end of John, but generally within the Gospels, there's no self-reflection by the author. They literally write in a third-person perspective, and just in the same way in which we read fiction. It's a story. Like the Gospels are a story. They're written as a story, which is not. That doesn't tell you immediately that they're false, but they're not written as if they are, like, for example, by an eyewitness, and they show no. Yeah. At least this is generally the case. There are exceptions within the Gospels, but generally the case. So the next one is propaganda, and I know that people won't really like this word and used in the context of the Gospels, but this is where a story is told to promote some kind of value-based or cultural message, and the author is like attempting to convince the reader of this via the story. And like this might be a moral, like social message, a message about like that relates to the current context of the author's readers. And then the final one is convenient characters, and this is kind of another literary device, but it's the case. It's the type of thing where like a character will appear within the narrative to serve some kind of like identifiable narrative purpose, and then the character will near immediately vanish, never to be talked of or heard of again. And often this occurs in conjunction with the character actually having names or attributes about their person that has identifiable relation to the story itself. And this tends to like increase the interpretability of the story. Now, unfortunately, in the case of the Gospels, even though I claim that there are many instances of this, one of the difficulties is that the names are usually like transliterations of the Greek, and they end up being a name as in like a personal name, so for example, Doug has a name meaning, right? And I'm not sure what your name means, but
dark and murky waters.
Dark and murky waters, right? And so my name means crooked nose, Cameron. And so imagine like a story. You don't know that my name means crooked nose, but often the names within these literary works, if you're a Greek speaker or if you speak the language of the period in question or like the story in question, you will be able to read the name itself as if it has like an identifiable meaning. So let's just imagine, for example, that you knew that my name meant crooked nose. And imagine that I appear on the scene within a story, and my name means crooked nose, and within the story, my crooked nose, so for example, like somebody breaks my nose and it becomes crooked. So it's like conveniently named characters who the function that they play within a story relates in some way to their name. Right. So that's the 10.
That last one's a huge one. I can think of like several off the top of my head in the Gospels where, whoa, like the name means what the actual story is talking about. Okay, so now you want to give specific examples or one example that has a lot of these things that are found in the Gospels?
Yeah, I'll give two examples. So the first example that I'd give is the case of Jesus withering a fig tree in the Gospel of Mark. And so I'll give a bit of an outline of the story to begin with. That should help you to see, like if you're not familiar with the story, this might help. So Jesus was hungry, and upon seeing a fig tree in the distance, he went up to see if it had any figs, but it wasn't the season for figs. Upon finding no fruit, Jesus performs a death curse on the tree, saying, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." So the scene ends, And then the next scene is Jesus enters the temple in Jerusalem and proceeds to overturn money changers' tables and disrupt the sale of pigeons for sacrifices. He halts the temple practice, allowing none to carry anything to do work, and he accused those of not honoring the commandment that God's house should be a house of prayer for all nations, but that they have made it a den of robbers. And now that scene ends, and then the next morning, Jesus and his disciples pass by the fig tree, and it's observed that the tree has withered away to its roots. Jesus emphasizes the importance and power of faith in God, prayer, and forgiveness of those who hold something against you, so God can forgive you. And then that scene ends. Yeah, so if you want to know where in Mark that is, it is...
I got it up here. It's
Mark 11?
chapter, yeah, it was 11.
So maybe that story, like, sounds implausible to you off the beginning. I mean, the first thing to point out, of course, is that Jesus has some kind of magical tree withering powers. But I'll go through some observations that I've made about this story. So a straightforward explanation of why the story appears would be that the events really happened. Jesus really had cursing powers. He for some reason saw fit to kill the tree, and maybe he was angry or something like that, or maybe he wanted to teach a symbolic point. But Jesus was really able to then halt the sacrificial practices of the temple and escape unscathed. And yeah, just generally all the details of the story were true. That's one explanation. Now, another explanation might be that, like, maybe some parts of it's true. Maybe like the withered fig tree part is not true. Maybe maybe something else happened. Maybe he interacted with the tree somehow, but maybe it's not entirely true. And maybe the temple thing happened, but it was maybe a much more basic thing. But let's just test the two hypotheses of it literally being true and an alternate perspective, which I'll now share. So if we understand this story as a meaningful fiction, that is like some kind of symbolic fiction, I think that we can make the difficulties of the historical implausibility of it all disappear, and make a lot of the elements of the story actually naturally make sense as interpreted as fiction, or effectively as interpreted as understanding the author as having composed this story either out of whole cloth or having modified it from some kind of existing historical story. So the first thing to point out is a literary device. The author of Mark takes the two parts of the interaction with the fig tree and wraps those, or sandwiches those two scenes around the clearing of the temple. I
have it up right now. So Christians, if you're watching this, your Bibles will probably even have the headings right here for you. So you notice Jesus curses the fig tree, Jesus cleanses the temple, the lesson from the fig tree. So it's like, what do you call this? It's an ABA structure, right? A literary technique of intro of a story, diversion, back to the original story.
Yeah, they've come to be called Markan sandwiches because the author of Mark actually does this on a number of occasions. And the other instances where he has parts of like the woman who's bleeding for 12 years sandwiched around the raising of Jairus' daughter, if I remember correctly.
Who was 12.
Who was 12 years old. And yeah, so this is what I would call like a literary structure. And yes, things can occur in ways that would make for such a structure in real life. Like as an example, I go to the shop, I eat some food, and then I leave the shop. There's kind of like an ABA structure there. But what's important is that there's things that are important going on in each of the scenes. They're not just like incidental details that somehow relate to each other. They're actually, this is a unit of narrative taken together. And we'll get to soon how it makes sense. So the fig tree and its lack of fruit, it could just literally be a fig tree and having no fruit, but it can actually be understood as being part of Mark's wider message, where the fig tree itself is actually symbolizing the temple and its sacrificial practices whose time has passed. And that it's actually no longer the season for figs. You can see how there's a symbolism there. It's no longer the time for the fruits of the temple to be consumed or benefited from anymore. And importantly, within the story, Jesus says that none will eat of its fruits again, which is effectively like a statement about the temples, going away. And the fig tree itself is actually withered to its very roots, which, as you know, like the actual temple in Jerusalem was also destroyed, which can be understood as an analogy of withering to its very roots. And that, importantly, Jesus emphasizes that faith and prayer and forgiveness of others is now what is important. And he talks about that in the latter part of the story. And importantly, that you will forgive others, so God will forgive you. Now, if you don't know this, but the sacrificial system of the temple itself actually provided as a kind of, or like functioned as a model of forgiveness for the Jewish people in the particular temple rites that were performed on an annual basis.
Okay, so let me recap. So what you're saying here is, hypothesis A is that Jesus was really hungry. He saw a fig tree. It had no figs. He cursed it. It died. And then he went to the temple and caused some trouble. And then he just happened to talk to the disciples later and talked about that fig tree again. Or the alternative explanation is he never really did see a fig tree. He never really did curse it. He basically this is the author of Mark is telling a story of how the sacrificial stuff happening in the temple is no longer needed. And really, it's about forgiving your brothers and sisters.
Yeah, and I mean, there's much more detail there we can get into. But broadly, yes, it's that seeing the story as something that historically happened has a lot of difficulties in its interpretability. One, Jesus is doing things that are incredibly improbable, for which we have very little external corroboration, actually no external corroboration of. He has some kind of magical powers in a fashion that we don't have any experience of today, and don't have any good reason to think other people in history had those powers. And he was also just even doing historically implausible things that are still natural. For example, halting the practices of the temple, which happened to actually be in enormous grounds with many hundreds of people involved, many acres of land where the temple operated in. And so here we can start to look over some of the markers that we previously identified. So the first one is imitation. Now, you may not have picked up any imitation here, but it turns out that within the Jewish Bible, and in particular one variant in a Targum that we have found of the Jewish Bible, there are actually some imitations here. So if we look at Isaiah 56, verse 7, I'll read it to you. These I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. So obviously, that relates to the quote that Jesus was giving, or what Jesus was referring to when he spoke in the temple. And then if we go to Jeremiah 7, verse 11, has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, says the Lord. So this is, in my interpretation, the author of Mark is actually just, cribbing things from the Old Testament to put into Jesus's mouth. And then we look at Zechariah 14, verse 21. And every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be sacred to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them and boil the flesh of the sacrifice in them. And there shall be no longer a trader in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. So I don't really think there's super strong literary emulation going on here, but there are at least anti-texts for things that Jesus says. So things on Jesus's words are actually things that are effectively coming from the Old Testament. Now, of course, there could have been a historical figure who pretty much everything that they said while they were in the temple were literally quotes from the Jewish scriptures. That's possible. But it's also quite likely that these details are being taken from a prior source. So literary devices, we already identified before that there's like a clear use of an ABA structure, this mark and sandwiches, which people have come to understand as existing in the Gospel of Mark. There's implausibility, there's powers of a nature, which is like a common trope in the ancient world, for example, controlling water and stilling storms and preventing disasters. And then there's also the improbable ability of stopping the temple activities, interpretability. So now we can see that Christian practices of faith, prayer, and forgiveness of others are instituted by Jesus in replacement of the corruptible temple sacrificial system. There's all-knowing narration. Jesus is said to be hungry, and as a result of clearing the temple, the chief priests are said to have sought a way to destroy Jesus because they feared him, with no indication given to how the author knows their thoughts and plans. No method is given by the author as to how he knows anything about the story. There's no mention of sources, and there's no mention of witnesses. The author narrates these events containing historically improbable things with no apparent credulity. There's no indication that the story might be false. And it also has a propagandistic message as well, because it really is and constitutes a polemic against the Jewish temple cult, especially in light of the fact that the Jewish temple was destroyed in 70 AD.
Okay, so we got all these markers of maybe why something is not historical. We have 3 paragraphs in Mark that hits a lot of them. And so you're saying we have good reason to think that none of those 3 paragraphs actually happened.
Yeah, so I mean, do bear in mind, it very much is a probabilistic thing. So each one of these markers, none of the historical implausibility one, I think, makes the entire story pretty implausible to begin with. But I don't think any of them alone prove that the story didn't occur as told. I think what's important to recognize is that each of these things is more likely to occur in a text that is a literary production versus based on some real historical events. And so when you see them all in combination like this, it becomes it becomes pretty hard to believe that it's really deriving from events that occurred in real life.
But I can put myself in the shoes of a Christian listening to this if they've gotten this far. And they're saying, yeah, okay, Cam, that makes sense what you're talking about. I see some of the things you're talking about, but that's just one little section of Mark. But when we're talking about the stuff that matters, like Jesus going on trial in front of Pilate, like that's history, right? Like it doesn't. None of these markers are hit. There is there?
Yeah. Well, seeing the story in isolation, yeah, you might have that impression. But I think we can find these things really all throughout the Gospel of Mark, and also subsequent Gospels that depend on Mark as well. And like you point out, I think we can also find it in the case of Jesus being on trial.
One of my favorites is, and maybe you can talk about it, is Barabbas. So how the Barabbas story, you want to tell briefly what it is, and then how we can say that this probably didn't happen in history?
Sure. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, here's like a broad outline. So Jesus, who is a son of the Father, as you know, the Son of God, and the God is our Father in heaven, he is held prisoner by Pilate. And then there is Barabbas, who is also has a name that means son of the Father, because Bar meaning son and Abbas meaning father in in Hebrew or Aramaic. And he's a murderer and a rebel, and he's also held by Pilate. So we effectively have 2 sons of the Father. And the crowd asks Pilate to release a prisoner, and it's claimed that this is customary. So there's this crowd of Jews who are in front of Pilate and in front of Jesus and in front of Barabbas, and they're asking him to release one of the prisoners. Now, Pilate asks the crowd if they want the, quote, king of the Jews to be released. And Pilate's claimed to be aware of the chief priests that they implicated Jesus out of envy. The chief priests incite the crowd to demand the release of Barabbas. And then Pilate asked them, well, what should I do with the king of the Jews? And the crowd unanimously says, crucify him. Pilate asks them what Jesus did wrong. And just once again, the crowd unanimously says, crucify him. And Pilate placates the crowd by releasing Barabbas, and he delivers up Jesus to be whipped and crucified. And then from there, soldiers lead Jesus into the palace. They clothe Jesus in a purple cloak with a crown of thorns. The soldiers salute him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they beat and spat on him, and then they knelt down and pretend worshipped him in like a ironic way. Well, I shouldn't say it's irony. I mean, you as the reader of the story can kind of see the irony in it, but they were mocking him by worshipping him. So that's the Cliff Notes. It's there's a lot more detail in the story because it actually is like a reasonable narrative.
The story of Barabbas and Jesus. Let's go through your markers here. and see how many of them it hits, that we can doubt its historicity.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's so two like important background facts that most people might not know. One of them is that Pilate was a like pretty ruthless Roman official. There's, from what we can tell of him based on other sources, he was quite ruthless, and in line with his character, he appears to be the kind of person who would be incredibly unlikely to release a murderous rebel. Historically, we have no evidence, and in fact, we have good reason to think that this is very implausible, that there was any kind of customary practice of releasing prisoners at the time of Passover. We don't have really any sources that indicate that this was a common practice either in Jerusalem or outside of Jerusalem in the wider Roman Empire. And it doesn't actually appear very in line with what Romans would usually practice in their justice system. So that's one thing. Another thing to be aware of is that Yom Kippur, if you don't know anything about it, it was a Jewish scapegoat and atonement ritual involving a section of the ritual where two identical goats were selected, and one is let free ritually and physically bearing the sins of Israel, and the other goat was sacrificed and its blood atoned for the sins of Israel. So that's some important historical background to be aware of.
And
like it was this rich.
And what you just said is basically the imitation part, right? That's
well, you can. Yeah, I'll get to that, but exactly. And there are other parts to it too. So on imitation, I claim that this story imitates Leviticus 16 and the Yom Kippur ceremony specifically. And there's in the Mishnah, in Tractate Yom 6, there is a explicit description about the ceremony, the part of the ceremony involving the two goats. And so it emulates the recurring, and then another aspect as well, which I won't get into, but I think it also emulates something from the Odyssey, with Jesus playing the role as Odysseus and the chief priests playing the role as the suitors within Odysseus's house, the suitors who are vying for Penelope's hand in marriage. But I won't get into that because it requires a lot more background knowledge to demonstrate. So in terms of literary devices, the story shows some strong dramatic irony where the Jews fail to recognize their actual king and they side with the wrong son of the father, Barabbas. And also the soldiers ironically call Jesus the king of the Jews, where he actually turns out to be effectively the king of the Jews, and they kneel in worship of him. And Pilate also calls Jesus the king of the Jews, which any reader of the story knowing the character of Jesus up to this point in time will see how just delicious that is with, that all the characters are just playing this incredibly dense role, not recognizing who Jesus was, but yet at the same time actually affirming. And interestingly, the same thing occurs in Homer's Odyssey, once again with the suitors and Odysseus involved.
What you just said, I think, is very important, that if you're reading a text and you're asking yourself the question, did this actually happen in the past or not? You're almost saying, forget about Matthew, Luke, John, everything. We're just reading this text and judging it in isolation, because I'm just picturing Christians right now saying, well, but everybody knew he was the king of the Jews, right? Like, so Cam, what you're saying doesn't make sense. But you're talking about put yourself in that story or in that narrative, and there would be no way that people would automatically say, like Pilate say, oh yeah, he's the king of the Jews. Like, where would that come from? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And there's actually this trope within the Gospel of Mark called the Messianic secret, which plays out where the reader really understands who Jesus is because it effectively says so in pretty much the first verse of Mark. But the actual characters within the story consistently confuse and misunderstand and fail to recognize who Jesus was and why he was there. And this, just repeatedly plays out throughout the story, where certain characters like demons and outsiders will, understand something about Jesus, but the disciples and the people closest to him and the authorities, they don't understand. And when they say ironic things like Pilate calling him the king of the Jews.
Literary technique.
Yeah, so it's a literary device. So implausibility, as I mentioned before, a Roman custom of releasing prisoners isn't plausible. And given our background knowledge of Pilate in particular, and this idea of him placating the crowds, at the behest of the chief priests, it could happen. Of course, it's something that's within the realm of possibility. Like, nobody's ruling it out as something being impossible, but it doesn't line up with what we know about him as a person, as a Roman official.
It'd be almost like Jews back in World War II pleading with Hitler for a favor, and Hitler saying, "Okay, sure, for you, no problem."
Yeah, maybe not quite as bad as that, but yeah, that is the kind of thing, like, where we know that he was quite ruthless in the way that he treated people. And Josephus, for example, attests to some of this. If anybody is interested in the stories, the sources, one book that you could read by an actual Christian author is Raymond Brown's, what's it called? I think it's called like The Messiah. I've got it here somewhere. Anyway, you can put it in the description later, but one of Raymond Brown's book on the Messiah. So we've also got obviously an interpretability thing. So we talked about the emulation of Leviticus 16, but understanding the story as a whole, it's the function of Barabbas being within the story provides strong interpretability as the story, as a Yom Kippur sacrifice. And this is also believed by early Christians. So, for example, in Hebrews 9, it attests to an early Christian understanding of Jesus as the perfect Yom Kippur sacrifice. But in fact, the story shows no knowledge of it coming from a historical event. So when we read Hebrews, which is a text plausibly earlier than the Gospel of Mark, Christians already understand Jesus as being a perfect sacrifice in the Yom Kippur, but this author of Hebrews 9, or the author of Hebrews in general, doesn't actually. I'm repeating myself, but just he doesn't give any indication that this is coming from some kind of historical story where Pilate, chose between two different
so what you're saying
identical sons of the Father.
What you're saying is, if you have an author of Mark who's writing this as history, you would think he would say, "Oh, by the way, this Barabbas and Jesus situation to me sounds like Yom Kippur as talked about in Leviticus, 16? Side note, now let's, here's what else I've found."
Kind of. I mean, I would expect that from like an actual historian, but what I was trying to emphasize is that there appears to be a prior belief before the Gospels were written of Jesus actually being the Yom Kippur sacrifice, but no indication of this coming from some kind of historical story. And so if we assume that like Mark believed Jesus was a Yom Kippur sacrifice, well, then that would explain why it is that he would cast Jesus in such a role in a historical narrative. So if it were the case that Hebrews 9 gave some kind of indication of this coming from a historical event, then yes, we might understand that. So there is an example of all-knowing narration in this story. The author knows Pilate's state of mind when he says, quote, "For he was well aware of the chief priests and had delivered that they had delivered him up out of mere envy." So the author could just be making some kind of conjecture, but he seems to understand that Pilate did a certain action because he knew that the chief priests were envious of Jesus and that they had given him up just for that reason. Now, of course, this all could be just some kind of conjecture by the author, but of course, it's much, much better explained by the author just writing this detail and making it up because it fits the story.
Yeah, how would Pilate, who doesn't really care about these people, know that these guys are jealous?
Well, exactly, but how would also the author have known that Pilate knew that they were jealous? And
yeah,
do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's like a double, because it's not only that the author knows that the chief priests were envious, but he knows that Pilate knows that the chief priests were envious, and knows that Pilate knew that they gave him up just because they were envious. Like, this is like you don't know the stuff like when you're dealing with.
Yeah, it makes more sense as a story than as actual history.
Yeah. So there's obviously there's no method. The author never tells us how he knew the story. But importantly, there's no indication that any of the disciples were even present who could plausibly act as sources. I don't think many people posit the idea that the authors of the Gospels interviewed people like Pilate. But the author, more evidence of this is that the author claims that the disciples actually fled at Jesus's arrest, and so there's no, like, not only is there no indication that the disciples are present, but we actually get some information from the gospel, at least according to the narrative, if we are to believe it, that the disciples had actually fled already. So, where did we learn this story from?
Yeah, if Mark was a secretary of sorts to Peter and Peter fled and didn't see any of this happen, and the author Mark doesn't tell us how he knows all this stuff.
Yeah. So once again, the author never it's just credulous. Like, the author never comments about the coincidence of the names Barabbas and Jesus, or Jesus, son of the Father, and he shows no awareness of Pilate's ruthless reputation, and therefore, no surprise at his use of some custom of placating the crowds. And then propaganda. Mark's casting the Jewish crowds as having rejected their king and the son of the Father, instead choosing murder and rebellion, because they remember, Barabbas was in prison because he was involved in a murderous rebellion, and so it sort of symbolically has the crowds choosing him, representing murder and rebellion, over Jesus, and ultimately the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And the destruction of the temple is kind of understood as punishment for the way that the Jews behaved. And then finally, and I think crucially, we have a convenient character. We have Barabbas, who is clearly some kind of narrative device with a blatantly symbolic name, who appears on the scene when needed and then is never heard again in the gospel.
Yeah. The Christians listening to this, they're not going to like any of this stuff, Cam. And they're going to say, but there's
and it's not for them, because, like you said at the beginning, I mean, they come to the text with fundamental assumptions about it being, trustworthy, and you can believe all of it. But when you look at it from a point of view where you are starting with not the presumption that it's history, but the idea that of what we expect to find in historical sources that lead us to have higher confidence or lower confidence in them. When you look at it from that point of view, it's just negative, 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 negative. Not only does it have a complete absence of things that make the story more likely, but it also has present things that make the story less likely.
There's just we just talked about two examples, but I'm going to make some claims here that Mark is the first gospel written. The other gospels borrow heavily from it. And so if you focus in on Mark, there are so many examples. Like, it's almost like there's more examples than not where we can go through almost every paragraph of the book of Mark and give credible reasons why one could safely say this probably didn't happen in history. Going from, well, we don't know who even wrote Mark, to we don't know where he got his information, and we have so many places that an author of Mark could have just relied on the Old Testament, and 90% of what he wrote about actually never happened in history, and he just used the Old Testament to build a narrative. Correct me if you think I'm wrong on anything I'm saying.
Yeah, so you pointed out something really important, which I failed to do so earlier, is that the dominant hypothesis about the relationship between the Gospels in the New Testament is that Mark was written first, and that Matthew, Luke, and most probably John, like Matthew and Luke almost certainly, and most probably John, all actually borrowed in one way or another from Mark, with Matthew and Luke actually borrowing a large amount of Mark's content, and John being more loosely based on Mark and perhaps Luke. And what's important about that is, if it's the case that these fictional narratives appear in Mark's gospel and appear to have been invented by the gospel's author, if we find that subsequent gospels are just copying those materials, maybe massaging them and editing them to their needs, if we find that, I mean, we've got a pretty damning scenario where the bulk of the historical narrative in the gospels are reliant on sources for which we know were fictionally composed, or at least parts of them were fictionally composed. And like you said before, I actually think that there's a really good basis to understand the majority of Mark's gospel as having been composed in this literary way. And we could look at more examples another time. But
yeah, and I think this is the reason why a lot of apologists or Christian historians, when they're debating atheists, really don't even use the Gospels anymore. They focus on Paul and the epistles.
Yeah, and I guess this is a bit unrelated, but I just want to read something. So Jesus turned water into wine in the Gospel of John. He walked on water. He died or had a mysterious death with a missing body. He was later said to have ascended to heaven. He did nature-based miracles like withering of a fig tree, and multiplying loaves and fishes, and a miraculous feeding of a giant crowd. So there are, and he stills a storm, which is a very important one. But take that into account and think about all of the things that Jesus is said to have done in the Gospels that are largely improbable. And now listen to this. This is by Justin in his apology. When we affirm that the Logos, God's firstborn, begotten without a sexual union, namely our teacher Jesus Christ, was crucified, died, rose, and ascended to heaven, we are conveying nothing new with respect to those whom you call sons of Zeus. Hermes, the interpreting word and teacher of all, Asclepius, who, though he was a great healer, was struck by a thunderbolt and so ascended to heaven, and Dionysus too, after he had been torn limb from limb, and Heracles, once he had committed himself to the flames to escape his toils, and
They focus on Paul and the epistles.
yeah, and I guess this is a bit unrelated, but I just want to read something. So Jesus turned water into wine in the Gospel of John. He walked on water. He died or had a mysterious death with a missing body. He was later said to have ascended to heaven. He did nature-based miracles like withering of a fig tree, and multiplying loaves and fishes, and a miraculous feeding of a giant crowd. So there are, and he stills a storm, which is a very important one. But take that into account and think about all of the things that Jesus is said to have done in the Gospels that are largely improbable. And now listen to this. This is by Justin in his apology. When we affirm that the Logos, God's firstborn, begotten without a sexual union, namely our teacher Jesus Christ, was crucified, died, rose, and ascended to heaven, we are conveying nothing new with respect to those whom you call sons of Zeus. Hermes, the interpreting word and teacher of all, Asclepius, who, though he was a great healer, was struck by a thunderbolt and so ascended to heaven, and Dionysus too, after he had been torn limb from limb, and Heracles, once he had committed himself to the flames to escape his toils, and the sons of Leda, and the Dioscuri, and Perseus, son of Danae, and Bellerophon, who, though sprung from mortals, rose to heaven on the wing on the horse Pegasus. For what I shall say of Ariadne and those like her who have been declared to be set among the stars? And what about the emperors who dine among you, whom you deem worthy of to be forever immortalized, and for whom you bring forward someone who swears to have seen Caesar, once having been consumed by fire, ascended into heaven from a funeral pyre? So this is like this is a Christian author written in around 150 CE. So this is maybe like 70 years to 50 years after the Gospels were written.
The first apologist.
The first apologist, effectively, saying that that there is nothing about Jesus that they say that isn't also said about the heroes and gods of the Greeks surrounding him. And, what does that tell you? And of course, later on in his book, Justin says, it might take me a little bit to find it, but
I have the power of editing, so don't worry about it.
I actually think I'm failing to find it. I lost my bookmark before.
What are you looking for?
Later, here we are. So later on, he says, when they, the demons, heard through the prophets preaching about the coming of Christ, they proposed many so-called sons of Zeus, supposing that they could cause people to think that the things pertaining to Christ were a catalogue of marvels similar to those uttered by the poets. But even though they heard what was said by the prophets, they did not accurately understand them, but they imitated in error the predictions about our Christ. So this is the excuse given by Justin at that point in history, is that really what was occurring is that in these times past, it was actually demons giving these ideas that were really predictions, but inaccurate predictions because of their distortion about the coming Christ. And so the stories about Christ, the relation of those stories to the prior myths and heroes is actually a corruption by demons in a predictive manner.
Yeah, and I've heard some Christians actually say that too.
And the importance of this is that we have a second century author very strongly attesting that what was being said about Christ is effectively in the worldview, within the sort of expectation, within the what do they call it, like the zeitgeist of the people of the time. These stories, they weren't unique. Now, of course, the culmination of them and like the combination of them within the Jesus story, of course, is unique. Why wouldn't it be? All of these stories are unique when you look at them in their individual context, but they have strong parallels with other heroes of the time.
If you are a Christian who just loves Jesus, none of this has any impact on you. It won't have an impact on you. You love Jesus. He saved you from your sins. Some of you might be listening to this and say, but I get meaning and purpose from this belief. And that's fine. Some of you say, well, it just has to be true because I believe it is. It just is true, Doug. And I have eternal life because of it. I'm looking forward. I have the hope of heaven. And something can't come from nothing. And I don't want to go to hell. And I'm going to risk this being true because I don't want to go to hell. I would say I'm describing most Christians, that what we spent an hour and a half talking about is for naught. But for those of you, sorry to encourage you there, Cam, but for those of you,
that's right. That's what I expect too.
But for those of you who actually care about what you believe is true, then I think it's okay to say maybe some things in the Bible are not true. Maybe some things in the Bible didn't really happen in the past, and maybe I need to take another look at it and just not assume what my pastor or apologist has told me is actually true. There's a lot of scholarship out there that disagrees with what your pastor or apologist says, and my guess is you just haven't looked at it. Is that fair, or is that being too presumptuous?
I mean, some of them probably have, but I think that ultimately if they end up thinking these incredible stories from the Gospels are probably true, they must turn out to be applying a double standard. Otherwise, they're using a method of historical analysis that I'm unaware of and that isn't apparently practiced with respect to any of the other heroes of the ancient world. And there is the problem, is that if you find yourself to be using a double standard to maintain your belief, it's it's special pleading. It's probably based on your historical upbringing or what you wish to be true, as opposed to a real analysis of what probably is. And it's I'm sorry.
It's okay to doubt. It's okay to be a Christian and say, you know what I believe might not be true. I believe it is. I'm going to live my life like it's true. But it's okay to say to yourself, you know what? Some of the things Cam said tonight make sense. Okay, I'll take another look. But I just want to encourage anybody who might be listening, it's okay to doubt this stuff. You'll be fine. You're not going to be hit by lightning.
Well, if you are hit by lightning, you may be taken up to heaven, so maybe it won't be so bad.
And heaven's up, by the way.
Yeah, just I do want a brief note on that. Has anybody noticed the fact that in the beginning of the book of Acts, Jesus literally ascends to heaven? Why does Jesus ascend to heaven? like heaven isn't up, space is up, the upper atmosphere is up, the moon is up. Where is Jesus going? Well, you know where Jesus is going. He's going to the place where the authors of the text believed was heaven. They believed that heaven was up because that was their cosmology. That's what they believed about the world. But heaven isn't up. Space is up. And the fact that Jesus went up is a problem.
Yeah, the authors of that time truly believed that heaven was where Elon Musk's Tesla is orbiting the Earth currently. But we know, based on the cameras on that car, that there's no heaven and pearly gates and thrones up there. So anyhow, thanks, Cam.
Yeah, and to clarify my perspective, I don't really think that any of this demonstrates in any way that Jesus wasn't historical. As I've mentioned before on this channel, I'm actually agnostic with respect to that, because I don't think that the Gospels were very, important pieces of information for Jesus' historicity in the first place. But I don't think that finding the Gospels to be full of fictional stories demonstrates that no historical person existed.
Yeah, I concur with that. My theory is this guy named Jesus was probably an apocalyptic teacher of sorts coming out of the Essene movement. And then the Gospels were written maybe loosely based on this guy, but borrowed heavily from the Old Testament and other Greek myths and created a narrative to historicize maybe this guy. But who knows? Like, I'm agnostic. I wish I had a time machine. Oh, yeah, this is a great question I asked in Sunday school one time. It was, if you had a time machine, where would you go? And I'm expecting all the Christians to say, oh, to the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. But no, none of them said that. They just, they said other places in history. But I'm thinking, if Christianity is important to you, like if your whole life, if your whole identity is based on Christianity, and if we did have a time machine, wouldn't the first place you go is the Palestine area 2,000 years ago?
Well, the difficulty is that there's a couple of problems. I mean, one, they don't actually know when these things occurred. Like, even
well, you could stay there for 5 years.
Yeah, you could. But they are so confident that it's true that why would they need to go there?
Yeah, that's the problem. As a truth seeker, the first step in realizing that you might be wrong is to doubt it. And if you're highly confident, I don't need to go in a time machine to see Jesus rise from the dead because I know it's true. Like, imagine any other adherent to any other religion saying the exact same thing. It's like you would say, shame on you. Don't you care about what's true? So just apply that standard to yourself.